Hey guys, who likes rice? Yep. You do? Yep. Yep. Jasmine? Sure. Yep. Do? Jerry Rice? Sure. Jerry Rice? Oh yeah. Oh, Condoleezza? For sure. No, you like Condoleezza. Okay, guys. Another question. Who likes Sites Reservoir? Huh? Sites. You like Sites Reservoir? Yes. You like Sites Reservoir? Yes. Brock, you like it? Yes. How about you, Gavin? For sure. Yep. George? Yeah, for sure. Oh, just a sec, guys. Just stay right there. Hello, this is Bryce.
Bryce, it's Ida. Did you forget that the annual meeting is 2 days this year?
Oh,
We get to knock this
Ida.
out.
Ida. Is today the day?
Today is the day, Bryce.
Oh, I forgot all about it, Ida. I'll be right there. Right on. Thanks for calling.
Bryce,
Hey,
don't bring the dolls.
you guys have to stay here. Stay right there. I'll see you later. Hello, you guys. Man, hold on. How you doing? Huh. Woohoo!
Hey, man. Welcome, you made it.
Thank
God, Bryce.
Hello.
Did you run the whole way?
Well, that was the fastest trip I ever made to Sacramento. Well, hey, don't you hate those new lights in the live oak? Man, I hit all three. Huh. Well, hey, great to see you all. Wow, great to see you all. Man, sorry I kept you waiting.
Great to see you, Bryce.
Yeah, it was great to be there with George.
That was quite a
George
group you had
yeah,
there.
whoa, nothing but the best. Well, thank you, Ida, for calling me and reminding me that we have part two. It's today, part two of NACWA's annual meeting. Welcome, 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 to quote my favorite evening philosopher, Jimmy Fallon, welcome. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for part two of the Northern California Water Association 30th annual meeting. Welcome. I am Bryce Lundberg. It is my honor to serve the association and this region as chairman of the Northern California Water Association Board of Directors. At NACWA, we come together to cultivate a shared vision of the Sacramento Valley for a vibrant way of life. We hope you were able to join us for part one last week, where we had some fun and we heard from NACWA board members Jim Mayer and Brent Hasty about NACWA's work in drought planning and our efforts related to drought. We were joined by State Water Board Chair Joaquin Esquivel and State Water Board member Sean McGuire, Interior Assistant Secretary for Water and Science Tanya Trujillo, Roger Gwynn, our representative from Washington, D.C., and the new Metropolitan Water District General Manager, Adele Hakalil. We also recognize two amazing leaders, Stuart Somack and Senator Nielsen, for their dedicated service to our region, to our communities, to water districts, and the association. For those who are not able to attend, the discussion is available on the Northern CA Water YouTube page. That is Northern, then spelling out capital CA Water YouTube page. I looked at it myself this week. Okay, look great. Please contact the NACWA office if you cannot find the page, and we will provide a link. And that's just how it works. We'll provide a link. That is something high tech. It is not sausage. Today, we will continue to explore the evolving landscape in the Sacramento River Basin and how our water resources, in combination with this landscape, brings the region and people to life. And remember, here at NACWA, we believe water is life. And if you would like one of these fabulous t-shirts, we still have a few left over from last week. You can call the NACWA office to Daniela, 916-442-8333. And if you're one of the first three callers, we'll get you one of the free Now, last week I offered 3, and I think we got 10 callers, so the supply is down. I had to reorder. I had to reorder 3 more. Go figure.
Good man.
And when they come in, you'll get your free T-shirt. Yeah, George Clooney, thank you so much. Today we'll continue to explore the evolving landscape in the Sacramento River Basin and how our water resources in combination with this landscape brings this region and people to life. The farms and ranches, the cities and rural communities, the fish, waterfowl, and wildlife. We will have a dynamic presentation and discussion to showcase this region and to explore this evolving landscape. As we get started, I want to thank our many sponsors and partners in this annual meeting. These are not only our sponsors, but these are also our partners and friends in safeguarding your water supplies and helping us manage our water for multiple benefits. I also want to thank Ida Noe, Daniela Ochoa, Rob McAllister, Patrick Kuski, who have done so much to prepare both parts of the NCWA annual meeting. In addition to Ida, Daniela, Rob, and Pat, I know that David Guy, Todd Manley, Bruce Hauderschelt, and Gary Link have all been instrumental in today's meeting and in making NCWA such an effective and supported organization. One of the great joys of being NCWA chair is to honor people who have been an integral part of the Sacramento Valley's fabric and our exceptional culture of success. For this year's Crystal Clear Award, let me introduce Bruce Hauderschelt, NCWA's Director of Water Quality, who will be joined by Pam Giacomini. Bruce?
Good morning, Bryce. You must have flown down the 99 this morning.
Ooh, well, yep, you'd have seen a silver streak. It's called the G.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Bryce. Each year, Northern California Water Association recognizes an organization or an individual for their exemplary efforts to improve water quality in the Sacramento Valley with the Crystal Clear Award. As our region pursues ridgetop, the river mouth water management for multiple benefits, it is critical that we ensure high quality water for all those beneficial uses. The recipient of the Crystal Clear Award has, through their constructive actions, demonstrated a commitment to improving water quality for agriculture, aquatic life, and drinking water beneficial uses. Past recipients of the award have included Denise Segura, the Executive Director of the Yolo County Farm Bureau, former NCWA board member John Garner, Larry Dominigani, Colusa Glen Subwatershed Executive Board Director, John Curry, formerly with the Dixon Solano RCD, now the current General Manager of Anderson Cottonwood Irrigation District, and Richard Price, the former Butte County Agricultural Commissioner, who I know, Bryce, you know well. We've also had the great honor in 2000 to recognize NCWA board member Steve Butler for his service to the Regional Water Quality Control Board, including 2 years as chair. This year, the Crystal Clear Award is the recipient of the Crystal Clear Award is our first honoree outside the Sacramento Valley. Yet his presence in the water quality arena is large, and his efforts have been critical to advancing the reasonable implementation of improving water quality throughout the Central Valley and including the Sacramento Valley. Here to present the award is Pam Giacomini. She's a graduate fellow of California Ag Leadership Class 21, former California Farm Bureau Federation Director of Natural Resources and Commodities, a 4th generation Shasta County rancher who raises cattle and stewards the Hat Creek and Fall River watersheds with her husband, Henry. The properties they own and manage are in the shadow of Mount Lassen in the Hat Creek watershed. Good morning, Pam.
Good morning, Bruce. Thank you so much. It is such an honor to be asked to present the Crystal Clear Award. The Northern California Water Association is recognizing Dr. Carl Longley for his leadership of an agency board that has grown to be relevant in the lives of farmers and ranchers over the past 20 years. Dr. Longley started his service in Vietnam, serving his country as an environmental engineer officer. He has worked each day to develop his expertise with more than just a few accolades, serving as dean at Fresno State University and director of the California Water Institute. His work is as important as protecting our water rights, which NCWA works to do each day. Rarely does one step forward to lend his professional expertise to serve on a board. It was not just Dr. Longley's 60 years of experience as a water resource engineer directly supervising or conducting studies of water quality, as well as environmental assessment and policy development. It was his commitment to walk the irrigated lands and understand the complexities of all who he regulated that made his knowledge and leadership so valuable to developing practical solutions that advance clean water policy for the Central Valley region. My appreciation for Dr. Longley started many years ago. He wanted to learn about the watersheds that he was responsible to oversee. With that, after my first invitation to him, he visited the watershed many times. He did a flyover. In case you don't know, he's an awesome pilot. He spoke and met with many local landowners. Dr. Longley respected the knowledge that we as landowners and stewards of our watersheds have. He encouraged us to speak to the regional board from our place of knowledge and understanding. He appreciated, since we have been ranching in these watersheds for over a century, we were not going to mess it up. Our goals are similar. We all want the best water for all purposes. We want productive watersheds that are healthy and clean. Dr. Longley recognized and appreciated our work and knowledge. For that, I thank him for his guidance and leadership to the regional board and his longtime service. It is with admiration and appreciation that I present to Dr. Carl Longley the Crystal Clear Award on behalf of the Northern California Water Association, and I would ask him for some brief comments. Thank you.
Pam, those were extremely kind words. I hope truly that I deserve those words. It's been a long trek, and as the years become shorter, you realize just how precious each of those moments were. But visiting you folks was truly a pleasure. The hospitality that you provided to me was nothing but the best. And quite frankly, having started out on a farm, and we did some ranching in the foothill area of Tulare County, being out on your ranch was looking at maybe the direction I should have gone in my life. That it is a beautiful, beautiful area. Your animal husbandry is evident, is outstanding, and working with you folks has been one of the greatest honors of my life. Bruce, by the way, has been steadfast in representing all of you quite well, and his service on CV Salts, appearing in front of the regional board, and I'm sure appearing in front of all kinds of other bodies is, first of all, he's highly respected, but that service is also greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Dr. Longley, thank you for your kind words. I know that, and I plan to make the trip down to Fresno in April when your colleagues celebrate your many years of service. Many of those as chairman of the Regional Water Quality Control Board. So thank you. I will come bearing a poster with all the accolades that you heard today. So I want to thank you for your time. And that's, you know what, I actually want to be in your virtual background in reality. All right.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Longley.
Thank you very much.
Well, Dr. Longley, thank you so much for your amazing service for well over 30 years. Carl, this reminds me of a wonderful anthology, Highway 99, a literary journey through California's great Central Valley. Carl, I was wondering if I could ask you, how many times do you think you have driven or flown over Highway 99 during your tenure?
Oh my God, I hate to think about that. Flying over it wasn't bad. I could put it on the autopilot, sit up there and look at those poor souls on 99, but driving it is a whole different experience, as I'm sure all of you have seen. You gain a great appreciation for the necessity to remain quite vigilant. I've had folks come onto that highway in front of me and force me on the shoulder and everything else. It's that's the epitome of being a racetrack driver, I guess.
Well, it is, and certainly it has changed over the years, hasn't it? From a kind of a rural highway to an amazing kind of international conduit for people moving from Canada to Mexico and product from rural to urban. Well, thank you so much. You know, I was thinking if you'd said you'd been through there a million times, I'd said if you had $1 for every time, you'd be a millionaire, but at least you'd be rich because you've been there so many times. Well, I always said, Dr. Longley, that Bruce should have an award like this, some crystal clear fish or something, but I think he said he'd bring you a beautiful poster with your picture on it, with the others who have been recipients of the same prestigious award. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. I can't, no way can I explain how grateful I am for your consideration.
Well, our pleasure, and really, truly, you have earned this many times over. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and I wish certainly a great future for you folks. You're essential. There is nothing more important than a continual communication. You have needs that only you can best express. Those needs have to be made to other bodies, such as not only the regional board and state board, but a whole multitude of other bodies, including Caltrans, of course. But we certainly appreciate your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you for your collaboration and your dedication. Well, at this point, we're going to start our next presentation. David Guy will continue to explore the evolving landscape in the Sacramento Valley with an in-depth discussion on evolving landscape in the Sacramento River Basin and our MOU partnership with Caltrout, Ducks Unlimited, and the California Rice Commission. David.
Yeah, thanks, Bryce. Good morning, everybody. Boy, it's just real fun to be here in the conference room, and I wish we were all together, but we're going to do that next year, right, Bryce?
Sierra Nevada.
Back at Sierra Nevada, sleepy little brewery up in Northern California. So I just first want to congratulate Dr. Longley. What an amazing tenure. Thanks, Bruce and Pam, for the thoughtful ideas there and remarks. That was awesome. Bryce, I just really want to acknowledge the great work that you do as chair of NCWA. I think we all appreciate the work that you do. And I think more importantly, we just really appreciate that you always bring these annual meetings to life and just make them fun, and you make us all better. So thank you for that. Today we're going to continue the journey as we kind of explore the evolving Sacramento Valley landscape. And we're going to expound upon the idea that marrying our landscape with our rivers is vital for fish, farms, wildlife, and of course our cities and rural communities. I want to start with kind of a little bit of a personal story that kind of connects me. And I had the opportunity to write a blog earlier this week that captured some of this. But I remember fondly people like Huey Johnson, former Resources Secretary in California. Of course, Dale Hall was a mentor. and we learned so much from him, former U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Director, people like Ted Summer, Peter Moyle, just a wonderful generation of people who are scientists, who are creative resource managers, and really just thought about what it took to bring this region to life. And I really want to recognize the value that they have brought to my life, and I think to the richness of this conversation that we're going to have today. So now we're going to springboard off that and move forward to the next generation of scientists and water managers who are really at the forefront of a lot of these conversations today, and really are the ones who are teaching us. And I like to, this recent book by Adam Grant, the Wharton professor, that talked about that we need to think again. And I think it really brings a freshness to this conversation. And that's what we're hoping to do today. As we get into the discussion today, let me offer some qualities that I think really define the group that you're going to be hearing from. They're all forward thinkers, and they don't feel bound by the past. I think that goes without saying. You are most likely to see them out in the Sacramento Valley. They're not sitting in some ivory tower, some place afar, casting kind of opinions on this region. They're out there with their boots on. And there's also something fresh about the cross-disciplinary dynamic that you're going to hear about, and bringing the different disciplines together as we all learn from each other. And I think there's a real focus, of course, on all the F words that we always like to think about, right? Fins, feathers, families, friends, and of course, floodplains. So we're going to be thinking a lot about the F words today, and different F word than Bryce was probably thinking about. Sorry, Bryce. And the other thing is we're both learning and teaching at the same time. These guys are both teachers, but they're also learning along the way. And of course, that's kind of the essence of Western thought and philosophy. And I think what really kind of excites us in the morning when we get up in the morning. I will just mention that there's one person who's not here today that I think we all wish was, and that's Megan Hurdle. As I think folks know, Megan is in a transition from California Audubon to a new organization, Land Life Company. And she's been so much an integral part of our world here that I think we all miss her and just really deeply appreciate all the energy she's brought to this discussion. So want to just at least acknowledge that she has been with us on this journey, and I know she'll continue to be there as well, just maybe in a little bit different role. So as we start to think about ridgetop to river mouth management, we want to start obviously with the rivers, the vital rivers. And we're going to be thinking about how do we make these rivers better, right? How do we improve the conditions in the river? We talk a lot about rivers. We enjoy rivers. We fight about rivers. Rivers are really the focal point for a lot of what we're doing. But I think we're going to talk today about the rest of the landscape, the part outside the riverbank, the part across the landscape, across the ridgetop to river mouth. And I think that's what we really want to explore today with you all, and see if we can find new ways to really support our vital rivers and streams and make them better. So, of course, that journey inevitably starts at the top of the system, up in our headwaters, in the healthy forest. And obviously, the past 7 years particularly, we've seen these headwaters on fire. And they've increased our flood risks. We've decreased water supply reliability, degraded water quality, and of course, been concerns about the habitat. Last year, we had a wonderful presentation, a wonderful discussion with some of the leaders in the headwaters, Placer County Water Agency, Yuba Water Agency, Nature Conservancy, Public Policy Institute around the headwaters. And just really learned a lot from that, and we're going to continue to build on that effort, and those folks are working hard to obviously improve the headwaters. As we work down to the lower part of the system, I think it's helpful maybe to start with our Natural Resources Secretary, Wade Crowfoot, I think, who has inspired all of us and had joined us in Chico a couple of years ago. And let's hear from Wade and what his observations were about the lower part of the system a couple of years ago.
Our California Natural Resources Agency, and in fact the entire state government, is really excited to partner with water agencies in the Sacramento Valley. These water agencies are really leading the way, innovating on these multi-benefit floodplain habitat projects in partnership with agriculture. Across the Sacramento Valley, we have rice growers that are growing a crop for market and providing wildlife habitat. We're excited to continue this work and continue to support the work and find ways to expand it together with growers and water agencies in the Sacramento Valley. There are win-win projects. that we can actually advance, that both foster agricultural productivity, secure water supplies for agriculture, and provide environmental habitat for both birds and fish.
Well, that was great. Wade is always inspirational, and we really appreciate the fact that he's joined us in this journey and really has been one of our leaders in this effort. So let's go a little deeper and start to explore these 4 areas in the lower part of the system that we just talked about. And let's start with waterfowl and shorebirds. And we're, of course, very fortunate to be joined today by Mark Petrie. Mark is the Director of Conservation at Ducks Unlimited. He has a PhD in fishery wildlife and just a really good thinker. A fun fact about Mark is that on any given day, you might see him on the river. He's an avid fisherman. He carves duck decoys in his spare time, and he plays hockey. So Mark, just really thrilled that you're able to join us today and look forward to your ideas.
Thanks, David. One of the really interesting things to me about the Sacramento Valley is even though the valley has lost somewhere around 90% of its historic wetlands, it still supports probably the highest density of wintering waterfowl in the world, which is a pretty remarkable thing when you think about that. And really the reason for that, the only reason that can happen is rice agriculture. I think there are somewhere between 500 and 550,000 acres of rice planted in a normal water year in the valley. And farmers winter flood about 350,000 of those acres, which is just the practice of putting water on after harvest. And originally it was done to decompose rice straw, but it has turned out to provide tremendous waterfowl and shorebird benefits. In fact, I think rice, that winter flooded rice provides about 75% of all the food available to waterfowl in the Sacramento Valley, and it actually provides about half of all the food available to waterfowl in the entire Central Valley. So it's not just the Sac Valley. One of the other real kind of benefits of kind of maintaining a lot of the Sac Valley floodplain and agriculture is that it's also kind of preserved our wetland restoration opportunities. And really since the 1990s, early 1990s, several thousand acres of wetlands have been restored within the Sacramento Valley. Really, that's all really added up to kind of tremendous benefits for waterfowl and shorebirds over the last 30 years. In fact, I venture that habitat conditions for wetland-dependent birds in the Sac Valley are much better than they were 30 years ago. And you know, waterfowl and shorebirds are obviously very highly mobile. They have really no problem accessing those resources that the floodplain provides. It's not something that we've ever worried about, had to kind of wrestle with. Clearly, that's not the case for fish. Fish have to navigate levees, they have to navigate water control structures, they have to navigate flood irrigation projects, etc. That's just not something we've had to worry about from the waterfowl shorebird side of things. But we've come to realize that fish recovery, that for some of these fish populations that recover, they're going to need access to the same floodplain resources that waterfowl have access to. And I think ultimately within Ducks Unlimited, we've realized that really water security is tied to fish recovery. And we're just as much affected by that as anybody. And so that's why, we've kind of made a strategic decision within Ducks Unlimited to basically commit to working with floodplain stakeholders, agriculture, fish, and fowl stakeholders to work towards fish recovery so that all of us can enjoy the benefits of water security. And ultimately, that's really important. If we don't have water security, there's not much we can do for birds, fish, and obviously agriculture suffers as well. So that's really been a strategic decision within Ducks Unlimited, and we're really committed to this partnership going forward.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. So let's now switch over to fish, and obviously Chinook salmon is the featured fish in this region. And we're going to be joined today by Jacob Katz, of course, who's a senior scientist at Cal Trout, has a PhD in ecology. And a fun fact about Jacob that I think is just so neat is that one of the first eco-farm conferences, if not the first, was on the Katz property many years ago when Jacob was young. And what that tells me is that Jacob has just had this deep connection since he was young to the soil, to the community that surrounds that soil, and what you can do with that soil. And I think that just runs really deep through Jacob. I've had the good pleasure to be on a river with Jacob, and as I watched him from afar, I thought he looked a lot like Brad Pitt in River Runs Through It. So thanks, Jacob, for being here today.
Oh man,
Much taller.
yeah. Bryce and David, NCWA, and just to be in the room today together feels so good. So thank you so much for that. We have learned so much over the last 30 years in the Sacramento Valley, and we've learned a lot about fish in the last 5 years and how we might reactivate this historical river valley so that it can again create incredible biomass of fish. But almost all of that work has really been riding the tail feathers of the previous 3 decades of collaborative work that were done by bird conservationists like Ducks Unlimited, Audubon, by regulators, but really by the people out there on the ground, by the farm communities, Bryce, by those that supply water to those communities, and that collaborative effort to actually reactivate the valley, the landscape, at landscape scale is so critical to our efforts with fish, because we've seen that a return to abundance is entirely possible, right? That you can feel when the geese and ducks take off at Gray Lodge, you can feel it in your chest. It reverberates your rib cage, right? And you can see it in the air. That kind of abundance is only possible when you work with and access the incredible productive capacity of the landscape itself. And we know that the valley's landscape is largely privately owned. So this is the working agricultural landscape of the Sacramento Valley. When ducks, geese, shorebirds, when they can look down beneath their feathers and recognize the river valley that they evolved with, that they're adapted to, when they can once again access the physical and biophysical conditions similar to those that historically led to their abundance, we see that abundance return. And it's my belief, and I believe the science makes it very clear, that it's entirely possible that we can reproduce that same kind of landscape scale change for fish. And how do we do that? Well, we have to understand that for well over 150 years, we've thought that fish belonged in the river and the river belonged in its banks, which is a way of saying that we divorced the water from the landscape. And yet now it's very clear the valley itself is and was a river wetland corridor. That incredible productivity and the valley, the very soils that lead to our agricultural production today, were the result of the connectivity, the patterns of water flowing through the landscape, flowing through the valley. And so I would say that what we're really thinking about is what a river is. And we're expanding those boundaries. We're understanding that the river is no longer a thin blue line bordered by steep levied banks, but instead it's that incredibly productive interaction of adjacent wetlands and river channel. And that now we have this incredible opportunity. The precedent is clear. It's been shown through the work with birds that if we can unlock that energy, the incredible productive capacity of the landscape, and reconnect that to the river channel where the fish are stuck. The science shows that the river channel itself has very little food in it. The food is made out on the floodplain. And by food, we just mean sunlight is captured by either vegetation, that can be a rice crop, it can be weeds along a margin of a channel. It's that incredible miracle of the solar panel of a leaf taking sunlight and carbon from the air and making it into sugar. But that raw power, the fuel that actually creates abundant fish populations, that can only get into the water when rivers slow, when they spread, when that water interacts with the landscape for long enough to move that carbon, that energy from the landscape up into the water to create bugs, and then bugs create fish. Fish rapidly become larger, and when they become larger, they have a much better chance of actually successfully making it to the ocean and returning as adults. So this idea, I think we have the template. We have the playbook. Now it's about being creative enough to understand that allowing fish to get onto the floodplain everywhere where that's possible. Let's try to do that. That's our bypasses, primarily in the Sacramento Valley. We have this incredible resource, and that the river still connects to the bypasses. Let's improve that. Instead of once every couple years having that large productive capacity of a flooded bypass, we can do it 3 or 4 times a year. And then we realized that the floodplain that Mark was just talking about, the formerly activated floodplain, it's mostly on the other side of the levee. Let's allow that landscape to produce this food and move it back to the river where those fish can take advantage of it. So we have a creative palette, a portfolio of projects to reconnect the landscape and the water. And when we can do that, I think we can really move towards a Sacramento Valley that can produce, fish, that can produce a really vibrant farm communities that can continue to sustain some of the greatest population densities of waterfowl on Earth. So it's a pleasure to work with you all here and to get to, I think, show not just the rest of the Valley, the rest of California, but possibly the rest of the world that this is entirely possible, that we can have both, fins, fowls, and farm.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. That was great. So let's now go to the third element, and let's talk a little bit about the farms and about, of course, the healthy soils. I think we all know that the agriculture in the Sacramento Valley is really the economic engine that kind of keeps the region going forward. But of course, I think we've increasingly learned over the last 30 years that there's an amazing fish and wildlife element to that. So today joining us is Luke Matthews. Luke is the Wildlife Programs Manager at the California Rice Commission. He has both a master's and a bachelor's in waterfowl and avian biology. I believe he's one of the first, if not the first, biologists that has worked directly for an agricultural organization in California, which I think talks about this evolution that we keep referring to. Fun fact with Luke that I think shapes a lot of his thinking, Luke grew up in Africa. His parents were missionaries in Africa and working on sustainable agriculture. And I have this funny feeling we take our bounty for granted. And I'm guessing that when you're in Africa, kind of growing up with that, learning from that, you come to appreciate, again, the soil and the bounty of that soil for farming, for fish and wildlife in ways that I think really run deep in Luke. So, Luke, great to have you here today.
Yeah, thank you, David. Well, I'll start briefly by talking about ag and some of the issues that are facing agriculture, both here in California, and throughout the United States. And one of the ones that I'm sort of most focused on is this loss of topsoil and erosion, right? It can be a huge issue. Some estimates are that, the average farm in the U.S. can lose 7.5 tons of topsoil per acre per year, right? That's hard to even fathom, and as you lose that topsoil, right, from runoff and compaction, loss of, water percolation, you lose organic matter. And, there's also a nexus where as you lose that, you lose, wildlife habitats both on those farms, and then on adjacent landscapes. So it really is a key component, but there are some opportunities, right? Some key solutions that have been implemented, across the U.S. And one of those is cover crops, right? Cover crops can really combat topsoil erosion, right? Because they have this healthy root system that holds the soils together and just allows the soil to really be alive and provide benefits to the farm and increase percolation of water into the soil and rather than out and running off. But those cover crops also provide tremendous pollinator benefits, right? From the flowering crop that exists there and can really provide other wildlife sort of, habitat benefits that are not realized by an otherwise sort of bare field. And so I think that's a really important component. And I've been sort of talking about agriculture at scale, but I want to focus just for a moment on rice specifically. Rice is a little bit unique, right, in that it's a wetland crop. It's grown in a flooded environment. And so the way it's grown and the way the fields are managed really don't have a lot of these issues because they're contained fields, right? So you don't have that soil runoff. You don't have, agricultural products leaving those fields largely. And so it is a bit different in that way. But just because we don't have these same soil erosion issues doesn't mean we don't have a key role to play in climate solutions, right? Both in California and across the West. And some of those have already been talked about, right? Mark talked about the millions of waterfowl that now rely on rice agriculture, in the winter. Jacob talked about fish and fish foods that can be produced in these landscapes and that can be pulsed out to the rivers, But shorebirds are another one that are really, really important, right? In fact, the Sacramento Valley ricelands are designated as critical habitat, for shorebirds. And that's because when you just adjust slightly how these fields are managed, they can benefit shorebirds both breeding in the summer, but also in the winter time, as they migrate through. And there's another component that the Rice Commission is really now leading on and really focused on, and that's to provide nesting habitat on non-productive rice fields. So fields that are idled. And in years like this, we may see more idling, right, due to drought conditions. And being able to realize habitat benefits on those fields is really important, right? We're trying to work and achieve the Central Valley Joint Venture has recently set objectives for habitat needs, right? Because breeding birds are struggling in California as those habitats are degraded. So there really is an opportunity to, right, use cover crops and benefit the soils and benefit breeding birds all together, right, in the valley. And so I really think that's where rice is sort of this unique nexus, right? It can provide waterfowl habitat, it can provide shorebird habitat, it can sort of be creative and provide floodplain fish food, fish habitat, while also, growing a tremendous amount of food, to feed people across the globe. So, we're really excited to be a part of this partnership and work creatively to really be a part of the solution.
Great, thank you, Luke. That was great. So the water suppliers in the region, I think in large part have an ability to help bring all of these pieces together. And of course, we just have an amazing group of water managers in this region. And one of them here today, Louis Baer, I think has really grabbed this mantle of floodplain reactivation and really thought really big about it and has written quite a bit about it. It's just a great spokesperson about it. I think folks know Louis is the general manager of Reclamation District 108. They manage about 50,000 acres and just do so much with that 50,000 acres of land. Louis has been doing this for about 25 years. He's an ag engineer from Cal Poly. Louis, I think folks generally know this, but there's just this incredible group of esteemed water leaders from Esparto. And I don't know why, but Esparto's like the breeding ground for some of the best minds in California water. And Louis has been a big part of that. And Louis, of course, had the great experience, I think, of working in the Kings River watershed, which I think brought some great experience as he came and joined us in the Sacramento Valley. So, Louis, it's always great to work with you on all this.
Thanks, David. When I noticed that you were going to say something up front about everybody, it made me a little nervous. I'm glad you went with that.
Usually does.
Yeah. So what I want to do is I spend a lot of time working on floodplains and trying to make them happen, but I want us to start thinking about it in context of the whole system, because really ridgetop to rivermouth is about a system and lots of different parts to that system. And we're focused on the floodplains directly, and I think we have great partners on the fish and bird side, and they can speak to that so well. But the floodplain actions affect other parts of the system as well in a very dramatic way, I think. And I want to talk about how it might affect our surface water system, our groundwater system, really the economies in our communities, what it can do for those there. And then near and dear to my heart, RD 108 is the largest levee maintaining agency in the Sacramento Valley, next to the Department of Water Resources, and things for me and for our landowners start with flood protection. And so that's primary, and one of the real challenges is having an unhealthy system and the wetlands in our system being so scarce. Every time you try to do something for flood protection, it's really challenging. So I want to speak a little bit to all of those, but first I want to maybe describe, and I think it's really simple, kind of the change that happened 100 years ago, right? We were settling California, towns were being flooded, people didn't have food to eat. These were primary drivers. We built a flood control system. The whole state of California, the federal government got together, said, we've got to do this. And it was an emergency type of situation. And so we solved a problem. And we solved a problem with kind of a narrow vision. And I think we've lived with that system for 100 years now, and we realize that it's possible to unwind some of the negative things that happen. Our natural system, the capacity of that system in the summer, is at about 5% of capacity as summer flows. Historically, the sloughs would connect the floodplains starting at about 20% of the system capacity. So a small rise in the winter months would automatically start to connect these floodplains. When we built the flood control system, we said that's not going to happen until we're at 80% of system capacity. In the winter, in the Sacramento Valley, we have lots of side flows, and we spend a lot of time between 20% of river capacity and 80% of river capacity. So when we talk about frequency and duration, we're saying, let's reconnect those floodplains when our rivers are at 20 to 80% of capacity. So the heart of our river system, let's make those connections happen again. And I think the thing that's really important is we can do that in ways that respect existing uses. We have amazing wetlands that are already being managed out there. We have lots of winter activities happening out there. But I think we can reconnect our flood system to our river, our floodplains, in that 20 to 80% and respect existing uses. And it's going to be challenging, but it's amazing that it's possible, and it's a unique opportunity. I think we got to jump on that. So when I say, how do the floodplains connect to our surface water system? The primary operator for Shasta Reservoir, the largest reservoir in California, the biggest kind of piece of water infrastructure, the first question for Shasta is, how do you manage for winter run? And it's because winter run are in a crisis, and they're worried about winter run going extinct. So you take extreme measures. And so if winter run can improve and recover, and I think if we do kind of this landscape scale level of activity, it can ease the pressure on Shasta operations and improve the yield of the project. That's critical for our economies, the Sacramento Valley, really for California as a whole. So the second point is really in water resources again, and that's groundwater. We're talking about a very large landscape. The wet side of the levees that we call are places where you have juvenile access. Just upstream of Yolo Bypass, you're talking about 200,000 plus acres. If you include the lands that we call dry side, where you might produce food and bring it back to the river, you probably double that at least, so 400,000+ acres. If those lands are wet and we get groundwater or we get deep percolation from those fields, that's even in the neighborhood of 6 inches over the 5 months of winter time, you're talking about 200,000 acre feet of water supply that we're putting into the ground. Those of you that are investing in Sites Reservoir, that's basically the same thing as Sites Reservoir, the annual yield. So you're talking about a $3 or $4 billion asset. And really the value of the asset probably isn't as important as the ability for our communities and our economies to endure longer droughts like we have right now without really turning those on their head. This year is going to be terrible for the Sacramento Valley and the impacts because of drought. If we had a stronger groundwater system, it would lessen those impacts. So the potential for groundwater recharge to me connected to floodplains is really a big deal, and it's something that we need to be thinking about investing just for that reason alone. Economics, certainly it's tied to water supply, but this really can be kind of a winter crop or year-round management for our properties. So when folks think about, operating their fields in the winter, some people are already doing it for wetlands, for duck clubs. We're starting to do it for fish food, but that can grow. That can grow significantly. And I think NRCS is an amazing partner. They're looking at doing a rapid watershed assessment for the Sacramento Valley to look at what is the opportunity and what scale of funding can they bring in to really expand those types of programs. And I think that could be really exciting, and it could help with the economies of the Sac Valley folks something to do with their property in the winter months. And then finally, near and dear to my heart, I think we can't do any of this without public safety and flood protection. Every time we go to look at a flood improvement or a flood repair, the biggest hurdle and the first thing up front is what's going to be the mitigation to do that work. If it's on the wet side or if there's wetlands on the dry side. In fact, in rural economies and our ability to pay, sometimes that kills the project. It means you can't provide that flood protection or restore that flood protection. I believe it's a very reasonable component of this program if we're going to really ramp up to 300,000 acres of wetlands in the Sacramento Valley, that we ease the pressure on being able to provide those public safety projects. I think it's that full package along with the birds and the fish and the beauty that we want to see in our Sacramento Valley. You put all of those things together, and to me, this investment is a no-brainer. And I think we have the partners in place. The federal and state funding seems to be in place. And it really feels like we're kind of that proverbial snowball on the way to roll down the hill.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you, Louis. That was a really nice way to bring all of this together, and appreciate you really highlighting the partnerships and the collaboration. And obviously that's ridge top to river mouth management only happens because people come together and work together. And obviously a big part that this group has done and was an agreement that we put together last year, an MOU to really look at functioning ecosystems and sustainable water supplies for the future of this great valley. So let's look at a glimpse of that right now.
California water is famous for conflict. Fish versus farms, cities versus rural, north versus south. And too often that has defined how we manage water in the past.
People thought it was a zero-sum game. It wasn't the understanding that we have now, which is we can get way more pop per drop when we actually think about multiple benefits.
What we're celebrating today here and what we're really acknowledging is the coming together of agricultural producers, water agencies, and environmental conservation groups.
The importance of today is showing a commitment that we're all working together. It's telling all of us that we really value agriculture.
Without agriculture getting involved, we would not have the waterfowl throughout the Central Valley that we have today. They are now producing 60 to 70% of the food available for our wintering waterfowl in this area.
A lot of credit to the duck guys for starting to incorporate ag lands into habitat and showing how it can be habitat. We've really tried to take that model and apply it to fish.
Rice growing in Sacramento Valley is not a bad thing. It's actually a pretty good thing. This industry is part of a solution.
30 years ago, farms were just starting to integrate to move away from burning the rice stubble to flooding.
All of that rice straw, it's going to break down through the winter time just from being wet. And all of the bacteria that break it down are what fuels this food web.
What we understand now is that these wetlands are also the energy source for making abundance for ducks, for geese, for shorebirds, and for healthy fish populations.
The bugs that come out with this rice water and make it to the river increase the abundance of food in the river system for fish by orders of magnitude.
In the Sacramento River Valley, these projects are having very clear, measurable impact on the restoration or the recovery of fish species.
This MOU is extremely important to the future because it's going to allow fish, fowl, farms, and water all to survive together, and not just to survive, but to thrive.
We're really excited about this science-based approach that we've been taking together to take a 5-acre experiment and then apply that to thousands of acres.
We're going to be able to use our farm fields to create multiple benefits for all wildlife and continue that well into the future.
What's happening in the Sacramento River Valley can and should be a model to the rest of the state.
What we're showing is that endangered species aren't an inevitable consequence. People can live with nature.
great. And thanks all for that. And Rob McAllister, thanks for pulling that together. It really tells a nice story. So as we again start to think about ridgetop to river mouth water management, I think our hope is that we can really start to draw down on some of the ideas that you've already heard expressed here. For those of you who have questions, please put them in the chat if you can. We'd love to try to get those questions answered today, and if we can't get them answered today, we'll get back to you as well. We did have a question already to start from Jim Mayer at Lewis about what do we need to do to ease the pressure regarding mitigation for flood control projects.
So Jim, I think it's a great question. So there are really two things. One you're already, I think, familiar with, and that's Yolo County put together an HCP. It's a great mechanism. It does take a lot of work to get it together, but once you have an HCP in place, you can essentially move around some of the impacts, and you can do it in a much more affordable way. Habitat Conservation Plan, it's Section 10 of the Federal Endangered Species Act, and there's a state equivalent. Got another long acronym, NCWA. So, but essentially, it's a mechanism to make it more affordable to deal with impacts. The impacts aren't going to go away, and you're still going to have to deal with them. But right now, if you go to a mitigation bank, you're $100,000+ an acre, and you're mitigating 3 to 1. And so, a small impact on a field can make an unaffordable project, especially in a rural area. So the other is the state has a program that they've been rolling out. It's called RCIS, a Regional Conservation Investment Program. And essentially what that does is it allows you locally to empower your farmers to kind of create your own mitigation. And so I think it's a great mechanism. It ensures that those things are made up locally. But then, so I think those two formal mechanisms are out there. I think the agencies could get creative, sit down, and when you look at a program kind of valley-wide like this, maybe the ability to do some of these projects is, part of an overall program, thinking about the Sac Valley as a whole. But I also think you start to lessen the need for the mitigation when you have a much healthier ecosystem. So I think, the idea that, every piece of property that you lose, every inch of wetland needs a significant permanent, high ratio of replacement, I think starts to ease. I don't think it goes away, but I think you could find more affordable ways to do it, and you could do it on a smaller scale.
Great, that's great. Thanks for the question, Jim. I'm going to hopefully engage in a conversation with the folks here in the room and really see if we can kind of drill down on some of the issues. And let me start with a kind of a fun but simple concept, puddles. When we're young, right, we all play in puddles. We, kind of kick stuff through the puddles. We do all kinds of things. And of course, boy, there's a lot of advanced degrees sitting in this room here today, and yet still feels like we're playing with puddles and working with puddles. So I guess I'd love to hear your thoughts on what does a puddle mean to you, and why is it so important to the functioning ecosystem and sustainable water supplies in the Sacramento Valley?
Well, want me to jump in? I'll do it because I'm very fond of puddles. I think of puddles, and the next word I think is power. And what we're trying to do is harness puddle power. And what am I talking about? How can I be so excited about puddles? Well, puddles are another way of saying wet land, right? It's just a way of talking about the interaction of water and landscape. And what I know about fish is that they're responding to a specific set of biophysical conditions. They're responding to the way that water flows across over through the landscape, right? Through the valley. And what the valley used to be was a series of big puddles. And what's so significant there is that there's enough time of water interacting, of water on the landscape, that you have enough time to route that energy through the landscape into the water. That's the capacity for the valley to actually make biomass, to make productivity, to make really what I think is a better future. So you're talking about a landscape where we divorced water and land. And then we're talking about remarrying that and that idea of reconciling our knowledge of how nature works into our management of it. I think that in a lot of ways the puddle really embodies that. It's not saying that we're going to just breach levees willy-nilly and flood or threaten our towns or our livelihoods or our farm fields. Instead, it's recognizing that there is incredible wealth that we've been squandering that is the direct result of mimicking and approximating those ecological landscape scale patterns. And we have the template, we have the tools to do that. So that's what I think about when I think about puddles, is the putting puddles back on the landscape where they make sense and when they make sense is really one of the most impactful things we can do. I guess the last thing is to think is like, where do we actually see puddles? Very rarely, right? When you do see a puddle, you can look around and find the duck that's circling somewhere, right? So I've been really, having ducks as a guide here to puddles is great. And the second is people are anti-beavers. We get that water off everywhere we can all the time, right? I mean, whether it's your backyard or a farm field or a Safeway parking lot, it's really that same thing, rushing the water off the landscape. And now we know it doesn't have to be 24 feet deep, right? We're just talking about, just calf deep water held out there for several weeks is all it takes. You gotta spread it, slow it, sink it, and then grow it. You have this capacity to make the food, to make the energy source that can rebuild populations. And I think can really reconcile, can align ecology and economics in a way that is a global model.
That sounds kind of like a new hip hop song. Spread it, sink it, slow it, grow it.
It's going to take someone with skills other than mine.
Can we put some beats to that for you, Jacob? I think we should try that. Anybody else want to add on puddles?
Well, I mean, to me, I think it's similar to we've learned a lot, right? We really designed a drainage system and a flood control system thinking about raising food. And what was important is we needed to dry the land out quickly. We don't need to do all of that in the winter months when we're not farming. And we're learning that it's really important that we don't. And so what's exciting to me is our drainage systems are manageable. We can unwind that during the winter months and we can dial it back up when we need it. And it's just kind of learning and adapting the way that we manage our landscape. And it's because it's possible, it's really exciting that we can make a big change.
Yeah, I guess I just echo what Jacob was saying about being strategic about the when and the where. And I spend most of my working days trying to figure out when and where to create puddles and just using. I mean, he said calf deep, but yeah, I mean even 2 or 3 inches of water spread across a landscape, right? We know these species, particularly the birds, are adapted to look for that, right? As water is puddling up or drawing down and creating puddles, they key in on that and they use it. And so being able to create that on the landscape can provide tremendous habitat. And it's amazing to just see you make a puddle and the birds just show up, right? It's pretty epic, so puddles are where it's at.
I think most wetland managers have gone in that direction over the last 30 or 40 years where they're managing their wetlands kind of like puddle, to use a puddle analogy, where they're putting water on there in September and taking it off in March, keeping it shallow, growing the kind of plants that they like to grow, but turning it all into a very, very productive system. So that we have only 200,000 acres in the Central Valley of these managed puddles, if you will, but we have 5, 6, 7 million waterfowl in a given winter. So but that all goes back to the productivity of these really shallow water bodies and what you can do with them, and how the birds and the fish are adapted to them.
Yeah, I love that. I think of it maybe as managing for the mosaic, right? Which is that we have found that the pendulum has swung about as far as it can towards command and control, towards this idea of, the river's there, this is farmland. We've had some really incredible success in reintroducing some of these wetland patterns. And now we're finding that we can be more dynamic. We can actually, every field doesn't have to be held at the same depth. that if we have a varying, a heterogeneity of different puddle depths across the landscape, some at different filling or draining parts of that process at different times, that not only can the birds access the water depth that they want in the right region, but we're also seeing that being able to drain that water out more frequently allows those bugs that have been for so long trapped on the dry side of the levee to move through the same existing infrastructure that we have now, the infrastructure that Lewis manages and others manage, both the flood and the irrigation infrastructure, and send that incredible wealth, that protein that grows in these fields, back into the stream channels that are largely devoid of that very thing. And that's a really amazing thing. We can kind of facilitate a feeding frenzy of fat fish on fertile floodplain farm fields. You know.
Feeding frenzy.
Wow, that's good. Good alliteration. Didn't know PhDs could learn about alliteration so well. That's awesome. So, well, let's, so far, I think several of you have touched on this concept of energy. And of course, you know, folks like Albert Einstein and others have been thinking about energy and the importance of that to our world for a long time. But it feels to me that people are really starting to rethink the way we think of energy in the Sacramento Valley. Maybe start with you, Mark Petrie. I remember some presentations from you going way back when you really started to kind of talk about this and your energetics model and some of the work that you did. Why is energy so important to this dynamic?
Well, from a duck and goose standpoint, it's pretty simple, David, is that when they're in the valley, you know, from roughly September through March, what they primarily need is food energy. And so a lot of what we do is trying to figure out how much food energy we need to provide them. And so I don't want to call it a simple process, but it is a pretty straightforward process. You know, we know what the birds need on a daily basis, and we look at things like rice, we look at things like managed wetlands, and we figure out how much of all that do we need to kind of support the traditional number of waterfowl which are here in the wintertime. I think it is simpler for us than it is probably for fish, just because it's easier for us to provide energy that those birds are going to easily access. Where, to Jacob's point, the floodplain has a lot of potential to produce energy for fish. The challenge is to get the fish to the energy, or get the energy to the fish. And in all honesty, we don't have those challenges. It's important, but I think we're lucky in that regards.
Jacob, you want to build on that for fish?
Well, I think it's the right way to look at it, Mark, which is that if we can pivot towards thinking about either we need this amount of land or this amount of water, if we can start to think as the major objective is thinking about providing the access to both these kind of fertile off-channel habitats, these optimal off-channel rearing habitats that fish need, or the benefits that come with them, right? The food that is made therein. So if we can think about that as our objective, as how do we either get the fish to the food or the food to the fish, and then employ a myriad of different solutions to do that depending on what makes sense where and when on the landscape. I think we start to have exactly that. We have a portfolio of solutions employed at the scale actually necessary to expect a population level recovery. And that's when we actually get to see the success that with fish that we've already seen with birds. Because as much as it would be great to model this and pilot it, you can't do it, you know, one postage stamp project at a time. And sadly, even if it's 150 acres or 1,000 acres, that's still a postage stamp compared to the not just thousands or tens of thousands, but hundreds of thousands of acres that we need to see interacting in this way, ecologically functioning in this way. And so it's really about investing, understanding that our investment in the landscape itself, in truly nature-based solutions, but these are nature-based solutions that are welcoming the wild back into our management, back, you know, where we are working with the wild, right? There's the famous Thoreau quote, right? In wildness is the salvation of the world. People misquote it all the time and say wilderness. It's not wilderness. It's about understanding how the world works, how nature works, and integrating that into the way we live. And I think that we have a real opportunity to do that in the Sacramento Valley on a scale that hasn't been seen before.
Can I add one thing, and that's, so what does energy mean to our fishery? And it's kind of a complicated path through the life cycle, but I think there's really exciting science that's starting to come out that shows that a very small percentage of our fish have access to that energy to make a healthy fish. That small percentage of fish is producing most of our returning adults. And to me, that tells us the whole story. If you can, from 20% of your fish that have access, produce 75% of your returning adults, imagine if you could change that dynamic a little bit, right? And to me, it just closes the door on how important this is. It is really important. Our next problem is going to be we're not going to have enough spawning grounds or diversity of spawning grounds. That's a great problem to have. Right now, we're putting a lot of unhealthy juveniles out, and they're not making it back. And so whether we're bringing food to the river or fish to the floodplains where they have a healthy rearing, it's going to dramatically change the number of fish that return. That's going to change many of the things that I talked about before.
The fact that we're able, that the Sacramento Valley and other areas like it is able to produce so much energy from a waterfowl standpoint means that really today we're not concerned about duck populations being limited by what happens on the wintering grounds. And that, to your point, is a good place to be. It allows us to focus, in other areas where they are limited. But the reality is that because floodplains like those in the Sacramento Valley produce so much energy for waterfowl, it's kind of taken that part of the year out of the equation in terms of limiting how big these populations can get. And so I would assume that you're looking to do the same for fish.
Yeah, absolutely. It does bring up a really important thing, which is the amount of hope we have. I think the template, the precedent we have for how to do this is tempered by the dire situation that we're in. And I think it's really important to have that context as well. And that's to say, I think we have capacity to really expand the health and robustness of our salmon populations. But a population, like any chain, is dependent on every single link, right? And so what we've been missing is healthy juvenile rearing capacity in the valley for a long time. And that's really what the valley typifies. That's what it was this incredible engine of productivity that produced those fish. But it also was connected to some of the most varied aquatic habitat on Earth. There's a reason the Sacramento Valley has 4 runs of Chinook, and that's because of springs coming out of the volcanic cascades at the top of the Sacramento Valley, snow melt coming out of both the Coast Range and the Sierras, and then rain. All of those different things are necessary, and so it's not that I am in any way detracting from how much we can do with rearing habitat, but it's not a silver bullet. We have to recognize, and I think that NCWA is doing so in doing ridgetop to river mouth, is that it's every single part of the river, it's every single habitat on which these fish are dependent. And that's what I see as being so impressive here, that it's not either or, it's yes and that we're trying, we're tackling each one of those pieces.
Well, let's pick up on that, Jacob. Obviously, everybody's acutely cognizant right now of the dry year dynamics, no matter where you are in the system. And what can we learn from these dry years that I think will help us think about the landscape dynamic as we go forward? I think, Louis, you touched on some of this in your earlier remarks, but let's expand on this, just recognizing again that we're in a horribly dry year and this isn't going to be our last one. How do we think about that and think about the dry years into the future in this model?
Well, I think that the very idea of marrying the rivers to the landscape gets at this. And what we're trying to do is get as much habitat, get as much benefit, both in physical habitat as well as the food benefits produced from that habitat from the amount of water that's available. And right now we have a system that was built that has really steep sides, where we've taken rivers that, as Lewis said, once connected to that habitat, to that engine of productivity, multiple times every year for weeks or even months at a time. And now we have a system that only does so because it has basically, our rivers are ditches. We have created, let's not get overly complicated. We've piled mounds of dirt next to just about all of our streams, and that separates the landscape from the rivers. And when we do this kind of thing, when we finally get to levee 2.0, when we start to realize that that steep side is not as effective at giving us what we actually want as having much shallower connections at the right places at the right times. All that's a long way of saying is that we have the capacity to make big water benefits, to let fish experience the kind of physical habitat and food availability that they get under large water years and under large events in normal and dry years. But we have, in order to do that, we have to update our water infrastructure, and we have to understand that we are moving towards this multiple benefit paradigm, that we're actually trying to, instead of maximize one component, optimize many. And when that happens, I think we really can start to stabilize our fish populations. We've built a system that is boom and bust, but it was directly because of our landscape scale land use decisions in the past. And that means that we have the opportunity now to integrate a 21st century kind of scientific understanding into that. And I think we can start to actually address some of the, not just you think of a boom and bust cycle as peaks and valleys, right? I think there's been a lot of focus on the peaks. What we're talking about is actually addressing those valleys, is providing physical habitat and food for fish in normal and dry years via this kind of infrastructural improvement. So pop or drop.
I think just, the key word is multi-benefit, that you said. And it goes back to your previous question. What is energy and how do you focus that? And, I think it's two things, right? It's seed production, which is food energy, and it's invertebrate production, which is food energy, right? And so can you figure out a way to use water for the most multi-benefit, produce seeds, right? That feeds millions of waterfowl, it feeds people, and then produce invertebrates, right? That feeds shorebirds, which are, not doing as good as waterfowl, not doing as bad as fish, but need help, right? And the invertebrates feed fish too. So, right, feed shorebirds in the fields on the floodplains, and then pulse that water out and feed fish, right? So you can really get the biggest bang for your buck, right? On smaller scale, right? In years like this, when drought is big, drought is a concern. You don't want to just put water everywhere. You can't, you physically can't, so really honing in on that multiple benefit. Where can you get the most bang for your buck and really, help the species as much as you can?
David, they're talking about this year as a 1,200-year drought, everybody's got a different thing. It's really bad, right? Yeah. It's going to be really bad for fish in the future, even if we do all this great work. Yeah. If we have another drought like this. The difference is right now, only about 30% or so of the years, 40% of the years are pretty good. We do this work at maybe 80% of the years can be pretty good for fish. This is a 3, 4, 5 year fish. They can handle a 1,200-year drought once. They just can't handle it half of the time, right? And that's where we're at right now. We're thriving on hatcheries and trying to spawn in Redding, which I think of as kind of the hottest place on earth. It's tough for the fish, and we're propping them up. We need to change that dynamic so it's fewer of the years that they have the challenges. And I think they're amazing that they've survived. I think they'll show us they rebound in an amazing way.
I've said here a couple times how conditions for waterfowl and shorebirds, I think, have improved in the Sac Valley over the last 30 years. And of course, a lot of that is due to rice and winter flooding and wildlife-friendly practices. But of course, we've taken notice of the drought here. How many drought years have we had over the last 10 years? 4 or 5? Half. And we're starting to realize that from a waterfowl standpoint, shorebird standpoint, we have some serious vulnerabilities too, despite what's happened, is that these habitats that we're talking about, rice, and for the most part, these managed seasonal wetlands, they rely on annual deliveries of surface water, which is a huge vulnerability at some level. Not, obviously it's a vulnerability for the ag community, but it's a vulnerability for the waterfowl community too. And so that's why we think that we kind of took the strategic decision that, look, as well as things have improved because of this vulnerability, we have to be heavily invested here in whatever actions increase the security of water. And whatever that takes, we think we have to be involved in, because as good as it's gotten here in the valley for waterfowl, the vulnerabilities are very, very significant. And we're seeing them in these drought years. Lewis and I had a conversation this morning about how bad it's going to be here, probably from a winter flooded rice or a rice in a managed seasonal wetland standpoint this fall. And so it's knocking on our door, no doubt about it.
One last way, just to build on Lewis today, is that another way to think about it might be that if you're a salmon confined, trapped between steep riprap levied banks, just about every year is a drought year. That it's only in flood years when you're not experiencing as a fish those drought conditions, which is to say when your world isn't confined between those steep banks. And so I think that when we again can make this pivot towards thinking about what it is that fish need and how we can provide it, then we end up being able to provide that benefit under a much greater number of years and amount of time.
Great, yeah, really excellent discussion. Scaling, you've all in different ways talked about, I think, both the desire and kind of the importance of scaling for these kinds of activities. And obviously there's a lot of really good work going on across the valley. We have a portfolio of projects that folks are interested in pursuing. We have landowners like Bryce and many others who are wanting to do more. How about we go around and everybody kind of give some thoughts on how do we best scale up and do that obviously at the right pace and the right kind of tempo, because I think there's a real desire to do it, but how do we best actually do that?
I'll start. I think, a good resource for me is the Central Valley Joint Venture, plan, and they have pretty clear guidelines in there of where habitat deficits are and how they can or should be scaled up, right? And so as I think about what we need to do, be it for shorebirds, be it for waterfowl, breeding habitat, wintering habitat, there's guidelines there. It's more about how do we get there? Can we get the water? Security that Mark mentioned, right? And really scale up or just hold at scale that we're doing now, right? It's more, in my concern, is a threat of production, right? And so being able to keep status quo and not lose ground is more sort of important in my sort of area of work right now.
To me, David, it's a huge social people exercise here, right? Because we're talking about doing this in people's backyards, and we're leading the Floodplain Reimagined program, and the idea there was we needed a big tent. We needed to bring everybody in. They had to have input. They had to have buy-in. People have to have awareness of the problem. They have to have knowledge of how to fix it. You have to create this desire to do it. There's a process to get people to change behavior, and it's not easy, especially when y'all have to work together on this, because you're not going to be able to pick one field to go put water on in the middle of all of this. We're talking about wetting large landscapes, and so a lot of times you need groups of people to work together. And so I'm really excited. I mean, when we did our initial outreach to landowners, the outreach lady that led this with Kearns and West, Julie Leinbach, which is great. She came back and she's like, "Your landowners aren't patient; they're ready to go." Right? And I'm like, "Okay, well, that's great. That's the kind of problem you want to have, right?" But I really think it's a people problem, because I really think we actually have a lot of the infrastructure in place right now. There's some tweaks with fish passage and juvenile movement that are going to be important, but I think those problems are very solvable. It's getting people to modify their behavior, and I think there are enough that list of positive things that I went through are so big. They're so important for the valley that I think we'll be able to create that behavioral change. And I think it's going to take us, we'll start full implementation of this program. It's probably a decade and a half, or 2 decades maybe, but it's all positive, every incremental step along the way. And, I just think that everything's in place. The partnerships, the right sort of knowledge, the landowner willingness, the funding that's available, just feels to me like the change is going to happen. We need to do it respectfully and at the pace that works, but it's right here. It's going to happen.
Jacob, Mark, have any thoughts on that?
Luke mentioned the Central Valley Plan, which for folks who don't know is really just a plan that identifies how much habitat we need in the valley, Sac Valley, Central Valley, for well-independent birds, among other things. And I think it's a good tool. And I think it's written at the scale it needs to be written, and identifies the importance of rice agriculture and kind of meeting those needs. I don't have a good sense of what the scale of effort is needed, similar effort is needed on behalf of fish, but I assume at some point, maybe it exists or we'll get there, or you'll get there at some point, but I'd like to see those two things put side by side, because right now, there's no animosity between the fish and fowl community. I think that's kind of behind us if we ever face that. But I think now we're at the point it would be really good to see, hey, this is what we need to do from a fish standpoint. This is what we need to do from a water bird standpoint. Let's see what that looks like when we put it together. There may be some compromises that are needed, but I think that most bird people would say what I said this morning, that water security is key, and we can write all the plans we want and establish all the objectives we want, but if we haven't got water security, we're not going to be able to execute on any of that stuff. So I think we're getting to the point where we need to bring the fish and the fowl part actually together in a kind of formal way and say, hey, this is what we have to do jointly so that we're meeting water bird needs and we're helping recover fish populations, and that is going to benefit everybody in the name of water security. I think we're getting pretty close to that point where we probably need to begin to formally work together.
Well, I couldn't agree more, Mark, and I think that we are led by Cliff Feldheim, the new waterfowl biologist hired at Caltrout, and Cliff has deep waterfowl experience and just led an effort to bring Caltrout into the joint venture, into the waterfowl joint venture, and I think that fins and feathers together mentality is absolutely the way forward. I think that fish still lag behind the bird conservation efforts in several ways.
We had a 50-year head start.
We're gaining on you. No, and the other one is that plan itself. Having a transparent plan at scale that says, this is how we define salmon habitat, and this is how much of it we need where. That doesn't exist at this point yet. There's a lot of overlapping plans. There's a lot of those components existing in different places, but having the community come together around that single objective and then having clear scientifically based criteria that says this is what this kind of habitat looks like. This is what we mean when we say salmon floodplain habitat, so that can then be put forward as an objective, that the granting agencies can say, we want this in this location during this time window, and then the community and the landscape can go out and provide that, can actually build it at scale, cost effectively, and then we can use those same metrics to measure to evaluate our performance towards our collectively shared objective. That's a blueprint to move forward, and that's one that the fish community hasn't quite got to yet. So, I would just point to maybe bioenergetics as a really important piece. We're now in the fish community only really starting to understand this really basic thing that fish have to eat, that our land use decisions in many ways interrupt the landscape scale processes that allowed energy to flow into the aquatic system and create and sustain large, abundant, healthy fish populations. And so I think we're starting to get there, Mark, and I think it's Yeah.
Oh, I think we'll get there.
Great. One more question for this segment of the discussion. Kind of trying to pull it all together. Jacob, I think you showed it earlier, but there's been so much focus on the thin blue line. There's been so much focus on the rivers and the creeks. And I think now each one of you, I think there's a lot of folks that are now kind of looking up over the riverbank, looking up over the levee at the landscape on the other side and trying to figure out what is out there. As you all look out over that riverbank and look at the landscape, what do you see? And why are you all personally devoting so much time and energy to that landscape that you're now looking at?
Well, I see a landscape that has to work for agriculture, obviously, and then layered over that in that larger agricultural context is how we see the floodplain and the benefits it can provide from both a fish and a fowl standpoint. I guess that's maybe that's pretty simple, David, but hey, what does all that look like? What does a working agricultural landscape look like that is providing the waterfowl benefits? It continues to provide the waterfowl benefits it's now providing, but now is a key player in fish recovery. That's kind of how I see it. And then bringing all those three pieces together so that they work for all those stakeholders.
Well, I'd say I see a mosaic of habitats that's largely privately owned, right? And I think that's actually a tremendous opportunity. I think conservation on private lands is the future, and that is really excites me and why am in the job I'm in, because I get excited about that. There is a urban wildlife interface and there's an agricultural wildlife interface, and being able to work with all the private landowners to have this coalition and really, figure out what we need to do and solve those problems. I think there's tremendous opportunity. And, you said earlier, right? Sometimes you say, we want to do something and the landowners are so fired up and ready to go that we're not even ready to help them do it. They're like, let's do it today. And it's like, oh, we can't do it today. So I think people are ready to go and there's a lot of opportunity there.
So David, I think we're all resource managers, really is what we are. And I think we've learned that you're not, I'm an ag engineer. I love water, and that's what I got my 4 years of education in. Now I've had 10 years of education in biology and 10 years in birds. I just think we're resource managers now, thinking about all of it together. And to me, I don't know if you can be singular in your resource management for a landscape this big and really maximize what can be done. And so Jacob's always talking to me about the river and flood control. I'm always misquoting all kinds of bird stuff and fish stuff. And so we learn from each other, but resource management is not meant to be singular, I don't think. There were single resource or multiple resources for lots of different things. And I think that's the dynamic we have going on in the Valley, which is why it's so exciting and fun. And landowners are thinking the same thing. They're not just farmers. They got hedgerows and they got winter programs. And I mean, Fritz constantly tells me about how he had, almost the whole population of this one type of shorebird on his field right then at that time. So proud of that, right? And we're all thinking about resource management in Sac Valley. I think it's what makes it special.
I just echo and amplify that. When I look up and look out, I see the potential for puddle power. I see, the need to look back to understand how the pre-development landscape and ecosystems worked in order to move forward, to do what we can to approximate those key landscape scale processes that create and maintain that mosaic of habitats, the physical conditions, the actual reality that ducks, that shorebirds, that fish respond to. And if we can do that, if we can allow those native critters to recognize their river valley, then I think we can really expect an entirely different set of outcomes. But I also think beyond that floodplain, really there's this, that I think about flow theory. I think about thinking about the flow of fire through forests is not that different than the flow of water across floodplains, the flow of sediment down rivers to our estuaries, which are now sediment starved, and yet it's that very sediment that's needed to replenish the marshes, which are going to keep up with sea level rise and buffer our cities against climate change. All of that comes back to this idea of pivoting towards process, of not looking towards trying to return any single fenced-in field to some kind of arbitrarily picked pristine place in the past, but instead realizing that we're part of this flow, that we as people are embedded in this landscape and we have the capacity to manage with a knowledge of nature, right? To reconcile our 21st century understanding of how nature and natural process works into the natural resources that we manage. And I think when we do that, we just have an entirely different set of outcomes that are possible. And that, I mean, that gives me incredible hope. It's what I work towards. But in order to make it happen, which I think is that we need to actually do this. We have to invest at scale. And when you can show that success, it will build upon itself.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, that was really, really inspirational, and thanks for that. So, well, we've been obviously having this wonderful conversation with, the folks here in the room and with the 4 organizations. If we could for a moment here, let's zoom out just a little bit. And first, just want to highlight that there's a lot of people, there's a lot of personal energy that is working on the floodplain. And one of those pieces is the Floodplain Forward Coalition that we are all part of. And this Floodplain Forward Coalition has really come together with the same passion that you just heard. And we have more than 30 organizations. We have the landowners that are really excited about this, as you've just heard. We obviously have the solution-oriented conservation organizations that are very passionate. Each one of these organizations is bringing a certain skill, a certain kind of energy, a certain passion to this. And just really want to thank this organization and this kind of way we've come together around this. It's very exciting, and obviously we have a lot more work ahead that we want to get to. And then also thinking about scaling out, we're real fortunate today to be joined, I think, by one of the kind of the leading lights in this whole discussion. Jeff Opperman was the lead author on the floodplain book that I think I have personally handed to probably 500 people in the last 5 years, and I think has really kind of inspired us to think bigger and to think beyond. The Sacramento Valley is obviously the special place we're talking about here today, but like a lot of things, we can learn so much from what's going on around the world, and I think Jeff just brings that incredible perspective. So Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your thoughts on how we can build on what you just heard.
Great. Let's see, I'm going to just take a second to screen share. And thank you for that introduction. Thank you for handing out 500 copies of my book. Or our book, I should say. With my co-authors, I think 500, that represents a sizable proportion of total book sales. So thank you very much. Great. So I'm the lead freshwater scientist for WWF, but I have all of my academic work was in California from UC Berkeley, and then a postdoc at UC Davis, where I got to work alongside a lot of the people that you would know from floodplain science: Peter Moyle, Ted Summer, Jacob, Carson Jeffries. So really learned about systems and big river systems by my time in California. Today I'm going to talk about the power of stories to help us learn from specific places, such as the Sacramento Valley, to illustrate pathways for a more sustainable future. And my first story starts with a Roman general with a very long name, Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus. but we'll just call him General Fabian for that. And we're going to talk about his confrontation with a general with a very short name, Hannibal. And so over 2,000 years ago, this Roman general, General Fabius, confronted an alarming new normal on the battlefield. So Rome was long accustomed to the comfort of having military superiority over its foes. But during the Second Punic War, the leadership of Rome was shocked by the looming threat of a numerically dominant force, the army of Carthage that Hannibal had led over the Alps. He came up from North Africa, through Spain, through France, over the Alps. This was definitely a new normal, in part because Hannibal had war elephants. So that was pretty crazy for them. As Hannibal steadily marched south from the Alps, the standard Roman military tactics had failed twice already in crushing defeats at battlegrounds called Trebia and Lake Trasimene, and Rome was next. So General Fabius adapted. He realized that his army could not survive another pitched battle and that Rome's walls could not hold. So rather than direct confrontation, Fabius strategically selected where to engage Hannibal's forces. He drew them into small battles on terrain that was favorable to the Romans, and he thereby diverted and diluted the army from Carthage. Now, some politicians objected. They said Roman armies stand and fight. They do not dodge and divert. But the approach was a military success. And it's now a standard principle of military tactics. It's called the Fabian strategy. Now, by now you may be wondering, what does Rome and General Fabius and the Fabian strategy have to do with the Sacramento Valley? Well, there may be some elements of this story that are familiar to people who know the history of the valley. So over a century ago, Sacramento was facing an intimidating foe, the floods that repeatedly marched down the valley. Now, traditional tactics of building walls and building these levees that were walls and confronting the foe right at the walls had failed several times. And the leaders made a decision. They didn't want to keep confronting the foe at the gates of the city, really realizing that the walls could not hold. So they chose to instead come up with a solution that would allow them to divert the foe, the floods, onto terrain that was more favorable. And today, this is what we call the YOLO bypass. So that's the start of the story, that we can use floodplains as a Fabian strategy for reducing flood risk. And even though using the floodplain to reduce flood risk is not a new idea, after all, the YOLO bypass is from a century ago, this approach now has a new name. And I heard it referenced in the panel a couple times. It's called nature-based solutions. So it's a new name, but the roots of this go way back. So today I'm going to be talking about how nature-based solutions can be something of a Fabian approach for flood risk reduction. Talking about how the Sacramento Valley is really a globally important model. It's a story that the world should know about using nature-based solutions for flood management. And I'll also really focus in on how this intervention was essentially not intended to be multi-benefit or multi-purpose, but it became so. So it was accidentally multi-purpose, but with time and with science and managers learning and working together, it has gone from an accidental model to a very intentional one. So, and that's, as I said, an important story for the world, for our changing world. So there's a definition for nature-based solutions proposed by IUCN in 2016. It's now widely accepted. And so nature-based solutions are actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, and simultaneously provide human well-being and biodiversity benefits. A couple things to highlight there. Natural or modified ecosystems. We don't have to get hung up on what is natural. It's all has to be working together. And that also means that we're not saying that nature-based solutions are the answer to flood risk. It's this idea of working together at the landscape scale. So this whole day has been a fascinating dialogue about that system scale approach. So I've really enjoyed listening in. The other key thing to focus on is this idea of benefits, simultaneous benefits for people and biodiversity. It's this idea of multiple benefits, also completely integrated to this whole conversation we've been having. So why are we needing to start thinking about nature-based solutions for flood risk management? Well, one is that the traditional approaches are under strain. This figure shows flood damages in the United States, basically for the whole of the last century up into the beginning of this century. These flood damages have been adjusted to be in constant dollars. So they were, adjusted for dollars of the year 2010. And what we can see if we look at multi-decade periods is that the average flood damage in the United States has been rising fairly steadily over this time. And it's double or triple what it was in constant dollars from the early 1900s. Now, this was also during a period of huge investment in dams and levees. And there's a lot of complicated reasons behind this, but it does suggest that this overall system is under strain. And speaking of under strain, the American Society of Civil Engineers releases an infrastructure report card every 2 years. And they just had one in, I think in 2021, and they assigned a score of a D for levees and for dams, in large part because of a backlog of maintenance that is needed. I think people in California are quite aware of the long backlog of maintenance. And so just another sign that the systems are under strain. Now, these traditional systems that are under strain are now moving into a very scary new normal, which is that climate change will increase flood risk, almost certainly. The IPCC releases their reports, and this is one of those things that comes out, they say, with high confidence. Looking at this map, it's a little complicated at first, but the bottom line is areas in blue and dark blue are going to have a dramatic increase in flood, the intensity of floods and flood frequency. What it's basically saying is, what is the current 1 in 100 year flood today? And what will that be in terms of recurrence interval in the future? In the blue, we're talking about a flood that's going to happen once a decade. In the dark blue, it's multiple times a decade. So the flood that is currently fairly rare, the 100-year flood, in many parts of the world will become multiple times a decade. And if you look, where are the blue parts of the world? Certainly the tropics, the whole band across South America, Africa, and Southern Asia, Southeast Asia. And if you look at the US, at first, you might say, oh, well, it's mostly those warm colors. It's the typical 100-year flood is going to become actually less frequent. But look a little closer and you'll see that narrow strip along the Pacific coast. You'll also see most of the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic and Southeast. In other words, it's where the people live in the United States. The highest population densities are almost exactly where the blue colors are. So we do have rising flood risk to contend with. And we have a financing gap for nature-based solutions, or for adaptation overall, but particularly for nature-based solutions. The World Economic Forum just released a report. They said that by 2050, there will be a $4 trillion gap in funding for nature-based solutions. And to fill this gap, we're going to have to increase annual funding by 3 times by 2030 and by 4 times by 2050. So a huge ramp up in the amount of funds going towards adaptation to deal with this rising risk. And even if we succeed in our climate goals of holding warming to 1.5, the risk will continue to rise. So we need good stories. We need lessons learned, good models in order to inspire this dramatic uptick in political support and flows of funding. Now, California is a great place for telling stories. And I don't live in California anymore, but as an outsider, what I will tell you is that the rest of the world looks at California very often and sees California as a poster child of concern, of disaster, as the climate taking its toll. But I think California has just as much right to be telling a story of climate resilience and a model of climate resilience. And this panel has been talking about it, both in terms of the flood risk and the water storage, and I'll get to that in a second. But this is the story that I want to focus on. And this story, just to reiterate what I alluded to at the beginning, this story has its roots from the very beginning of California as a state. Right after the gold rush, the very young town of Sacramento was hit by a flood. The Placer Times, which was the newspaper at the time, quite breezily and optimistically said, it will be seen that Sacramento City can be easily protected against inundations, and that too at comparatively small expense. So their first reaction to the big flood was, we got this, and it's not gonna be that hard. Well, actually, and what's funny is that's a quote from 1850. This image is the Sacramento flood of 1860. So that gives you a little indication of that breezy optimism of 1850, what happened only 10 years later and continued to happen multiple times in the second half of the 19th century. In response, levees, counties and private landowners and cities were building levees up and down the valley, trying to confine the river. And as many of you know, trying to confine the river in part also to flush out all that mining debris. But the levees were being built, not in a strategic way, but were being built close to the river. And the levees continued to fail, often spectacularly, and the flooding continued to happen. And so that's when this Fabian strategy emerged. Now, they didn't think about it, and they didn't think about nature-based solutions, but this Sacramento flood system that emerged was a reconnection of historic parts of the floodplain. The Sutter bypass and the Yolo bypass, collectively something like 80,000 acres that had been levied off in an attempt to confine the river, were now being reconnected. Now, again, it was not thought of as a floodplain reconnection project at all, but functionally, that's what it wound up looking like. And it was strictly coming from the flood managers. They were saying, we need to convey the floods through more space. We need more conveyance space. There was no mention or intention of ecological restoration. There's a master's thesis or a dissertation from UC Berkeley all about the Yolo bypass and how it was formed. And I scoured that. I couldn't find any reference to restoration or ecosystems. It was only a flood solution. If there was any discussion of fish, it was only about the risk of stranding. And the bypass has worked incredibly well as a flood risk reduction piece of infrastructure. So this is the flood of 1986. This is the amount of water that was passing by Sacramento at the peak of the flood in 1986. And the red dashed line is the capacity of the channel between the levees as Sacramento River flows through the town. And the gray is the level of the Sacramento River in that channel. You can see it got right up to the top of the levees about twice, but it didn't overtop. And it's also very small amount of water compared to what that flood was. Well, of course, you all know 80% of the floodwaters were out on the Yolo bypass. So it is a critical piece of infrastructure for flood management. But new stories were emerging. Right about that time, really, late 80s into the 90s, when people like Ted Summer began to tell another story about fish. Now, the feathers on the floodplain had been obvious to everyone because you can see them. The fins on the floodplain had been mostly invisible until people started taking nets and seeing what was coming up. So Ted Summer began to talk about the value of the floodplain for native fish. And people began to ask, well, what do native fish need? And you've been hearing all about it, this food productivity. Well, people started looking and defining the activation flood. It was a long duration, frequent springtime flood. And where does it occur in the system? Well, north of Hamilton City, in that area, the complex channels do allow for this long duration springtime flood to still happen. But for much of the Sacramento River, downstream of Colusa, it's just rising and falling in those steep banks that Jacob referred to. So where is this floodplain activation flood that is so important to fish? It's largely in the bypasses. So this is the map of it from a paper from Phil Williams of where that is occurring, mostly in the bypasses. And so more stories were being told, this value of floods for fish, and that getting fish out on the floodplain would have value, and reconnecting like the Cosumnes, reconnecting the Cosumnes floodplain was going to have value. And then what Jacob and the rest of the panel have been talking about, working with landowners to figure out ways to get the fish on the floodplain or the food from the floodplain to the fish. But science is also telling us that this long duration spring flood is much more rare than it used to be. So this is showing the proportion of years that there was a long duration spring flood moving over these weirs into the bypass system. Pre-Shasta, it happened 80% of the time. There was a long duration spring flood that was coming over those bypasses, inundating the land there. Post-Shasta, it dropped to a little over 20%. So this is where scientists and managers again began to talk and problem solve, thinking about the big notch in the Yolo bypass. How can we reoperate this infrastructure that was originally just for flood management? How can we reoperate it for multiple benefits and have a bit more control about when it floods and how much and what time of year, duration, thinking about food production and fish access. Just an amazing story of landowners, managers, and scientists working together to solve problems. And again, just to close here, this is an important story for the rest of the world. The flood risk is going to be rising, including in many places that have unconfined rivers. So how do we take these lessons and say, maybe don't put levees right next to the channel to confine to the rivers, work with the processes as much as possible, find solutions, they're going to be hybrid solutions, but find those solutions to manage your flood risks. Similarly, going forward, people are talking about a storage gap. So we have the reservoir storage, and groups like the World Bank and the Global Water Partnership are now talking about a storage gap, because drought and scarcity are also going to be increasing with climate change. But they're now talking about integrated storage. It's not just the reservoirs behind dams, but it's the storage of water in the soils, in the forests, what's above the reservoir system. It's also about what's downstream of the reservoir system, a recharge of aquifers and all that. And then I got this, David Guy sent this to me, and I thought, well, this looks a lot like a system of integrated storage components. You've got your forests that you're thinking about, but you've got your sustainable groundwater management, managed aquifer recharge. So California can keep telling these kinds of stories. Now, and just to close, what's really important here, and why I think the California story is an important one, there are funds that are being established to do adaptation, like the Green Climate Fund, but that's been a few $1 billion over the past decade. What the real prize is when land managers and resource agencies incorporate this into how they do business. The Corps of Engineers has a budget that's $6 or $7 billion a year. So that's a lot more than the amount that's gone into adaptation from the Green Climate Fund. That's a big agency, but it's just one country. So when we get management agencies like DWR, Corps of Engineers, and land managers implementing this as a regular part of the practice, then it goes from a niche into really how things get done. And the fact that California now has a multi-benefit floodplain policy is really the icing on the cake of bringing this all around to having a policy that supports all these lessons and collaborations that have been emerging from the Valley. And so that, I think, is a story that I love to tell, and a story that California can be really proud to tell. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. That was excellent, really inspiring as well. And boy, thanks for all your work and leadership on this. So I think as we start to, again, kind of explore this idea of ridgetop to river mouth and think a little bit more about what we can be doing, the question, of course, that we all seem to get is what can we do, or what next, or what people want to spring into action, and obviously that's a great thing. So I'm just going to offer a couple of thoughts on this. If you're a landowner, boy, please come join the effort. As we've heard before, there's a lot of landowners that are wanting to pursue this, want to participate in this, and we're learning every day how that can work. So if you're a landowner, please come and join in this process in the Sacramento Valley. Projects, we have a portfolio of projects that folks have stepped forward with. These are projects that are advanced by water suppliers, by landowners, by conservation organizations. We would love to explore additional projects. So if you have a project that you feel it would be really helpful to this effort, please come join that. We have a portfolio, and we would love to continue to expand and build that portfolio of projects going forward. Permits, obviously a lot of work has to go into getting these kinds of efforts done on the ground. And so I know that folks in the regulatory world want to be helpful in advancing these efforts. And we hope that there's ways to simplify and in some cases expedite the permit process. There's been a really concerted effort on this over the last some years, and just to really appreciate all those who are working on that to make sure that the permitting process is is solid, but obviously can move forward in the pace that we all want to see going forward. And then finally, we're just really appreciative of the various funding sources. There's been some amazing state funding for these efforts that we really appreciate from the legislature, from the Resources Agency, and others. So we really appreciate that. We're seeing increasing funding from the federal arena as well, and just really appreciate those efforts. And we're working obviously with a lot of private entities and other nonprofits to seek some additional funding. This is going to require some significant funding to obviously create the incentives and the work that's needed to get this done. So I think there's an opportunity for everybody to be involved in this, and we hope that this is in part a call to action as we think about that going forward. So I think with that, I think we're going to see if there's some additional questions. I know we have a couple in the chat room. We have obviously the folks that are sitting here in the room, as well as Jeff Opperman is still staying on. Thank you, Jeff, for that. So I first want to just acknowledge in the chat that Jim Cogswell put in the Central Valley Joint Venture plan in the chat. Thank you for that, Jim, that Mark Petrie mentioned. And so I'm going to go to a couple of questions. Actually, Bryce, do you have a question before we jump to the chat?
Well, this has just been inspirational. It's been amazing, almost mind-boggling. I loved a lot of the terms that you guys used. Jacob, return to abundance, and the importance of puddles, and the programs. I guess what the question I have is, we have fish biologists, and I think you guys have discussed this somewhat already. We have fish biologists, waterfowl scientists, farmers, and water suppliers here, and floodplain scientists. And I've heard we can do it, Louis. I just think you've spoken to it a little bit, but what is missing? Do we have all the pieces? If you could say, I wish, and answer what is next, or we need, and what is next, what would you answer the I wish? Because we have so much coming together. Are we missing anything, or is it all there?
So, Bryce, I would say that it sounds simple, but we need to change projects to a program. We need to have the right collective and decision-making body to prioritize resources to achieve the group's collective goals. And kind of like the joint venture, we need to spell those goals out clearly enough so that governing body does. I think everybody's got a bunch of great ideas, but we're all kind of managing them in our own little silos and sharing them a little bit. I think it needs structure. Something this big and this transformative for the Valley needs some more structure to it. And the exciting thing is, I think that's exactly what we're doing right now. I think everybody will see that. Everybody will have an opportunity to engage in that. And I think that's the next step on a fast track to getting a lot of this done.
Does the name Ignaz Semmelweis mean anything to anybody?
No, but Fabian does.
Now you got Fabian.
And you and Jeff's intellect is just beyond my little sensibilities here.
Dr. Semmelweis was the presiding doctor at Vienna General Hospital in 1846, and he was the first person to show that if he got his doctors fresh from an autopsy to wash their hands before they went into the maternity ward to deliver a baby, that you had much better outcomes. You had both mother and child survive dramatically better. And you would expect, oh my God, he improved, survival by 90%. Everyone is going to do something that's fairly simple, wash their hands. That's not what happened, right? It was 125 years until the CDC actually made hand washing a standard practice before surgery. There is something else that's needed besides it's a good idea, besides scientific basis, besides where do you get that buy-in? And I think that part of it's what we're doing now. We're doing this together, right? That there's a huge piece that something about the way that Dr. Semmelweis did that, he actually alienated his doctors. They felt like they were being blamed for those outcomes. So he said, no, so we're not going to wash our hands anymore. And they went back to not doing so. There's always this large turn of history that I think is part. This is the zeitgeist of the time. We're talking about something that is absolutely necessary. That investment in nature-based solutions isn't just a good idea, it's the most profitable idea. We understand that when we look to the skies in California every year, because 120 years of letting Smokey the Bear put out every fire didn't really work out the way we wanted, right? So now we understand that not only does it cost us billions of dollars to fight those fires, but it costs us even more to live with a world where fire is, expected every summer. But as expensive as that is, the understanding that it's our management decisions that led us here, forest management and fires is nothing as far as the both the ecological and the economic impact as our management of water and rivers. What we have an opportunity to do now is give a model to political leadership where they can actually show that there is the political movement to step forward into a new way of thinking. That this is the best way forward. It's the way that brings together both economy and ecology, but it also brings together people from both sides of the aisle, from the north and from the south. It creates that social movement into the kind of future that we need to build. And I think that that's the first thing, is how do we build those political champions to take this idea of true stewardship and the profitable underlying ecological impact of that stewardship out into the political space. And so that's the part that I think is most pressing.
I would agree. I think political support is key, but I would echo something Mark said earlier, and that's water security, right? None of this happens without some level of water security, right? And that's an I wish, right? If we had that, a lot of this other stuff could sort of go away and we could just do it. But right now it's all a lot of theory because, well, we don't have water a lot of times. So that's, for me, the biggest sort of component right now is water security.
How can you have puddles without water security?
Well, no, I think how can you have water security without puddles? So I think that yes, but it is exactly through the way that we get to security, or at least more security than we have now, is through having an ecologically functioning, diverse landscape that's capable of both creating the habitat necessities and benefits that grow abundant, resilient populations, but also recognize some really key things. That it's only through spreading water that you can sink it and that you can actually put the money back in. You can deposit the very bank account that this economy in California depends on. Our groundwater is the most important resource we have. That, we interrupted that. We stopped depositing that resource, that wealth, into the bank account when we levied the system. So I think that it's, it's both, that it's through the practices that we're talking about that we decrease the chief liability to moving water from where it's more abundant to where it's needed. And that's that we can actually have ecologically functioning ecosystems.
I think water security is a banner we can all unite under.
Yeah.
And then have the necessary structure that you talked about. I think water security means, we just have to define what water security means to each of the different stakeholders. I can tell you what water security probably means from a waterfowl standpoint. Somebody in the agricultural community is going to do a much better job about telling me what water security means to the agricultural community. Jacob, water security, you might not mean water security. It might mean the timing and duration of overbank flooding. That's how you might define water security.
Yeah.
But as fish would, require it.
Right.
But I think water security is, and it's certainly a term that politicians understand. We just need to maybe refine on what it means for our different, the different stakeholders here. I don't think it's in any way opposed. I don't think there's contradictions there. But
Jeff, you have any thoughts on Bryce's question?
Well, I think what just really strikes me about hearing this conversation is just the way these players, that the organizations represented in this room and others, have moved beyond conflict towards a view of solving each other's problems and seeing the world broad enough to understand each other's problems, understand the need for regulatory certainty, or the ability to manage land and water in certain ways, or the ability to grow food and get it to fish. And it's really heartening to me to hear people from these traditional sectors that you would think that might be really at each other's throats, particularly during these stressful times. Just knowing that California has been through serious water stress, and to have this ethos of collaborative searching for solutions hold together, that's really heartening. So I think that there's a lot of technical insights that can come out of this, but as far as lessons and stories to try to get this catalyzed in other parts of the world, figuring out how these groups began to collaborate, that to me is a way to get this moving towards scale in other places. Because I also think that people are going to have to, if they can avoid the at each other's throats period and move more quickly to the collaborative searching to solve each other's problems, that will be really helpful to get this at scale in other places.
Yeah, Jim, my hope is that the model here, the collaborative model that you just described, takes root at some time in the Klamath Basin, because we're seeing that kind of conflict right now and the consequences of it, and everybody's suffering as a result of it. And I think this is a pretty good model of how we might want to think about addressing some of these ag, fish, fowl problems in the Klamath Basin. And that's certainly not going in the right direction now. But it's their problems are not dissimilar to the problems that we face down here.
Let's go to a couple of questions in the chat, if we could. Got a good question, I think, from Mark Walters, kind of thinking around the term on how things are going to function in perpetuity. And Mark specifically asks, how are these voluntary projects funded or implemented to function for perpetuity? And second, what are your thoughts on truly returning land to the river through permanent restoration of previously reclaimed lands? Any thoughts on this question of perpetuity and how we should be thinking about that?
I think about it a lot, and I think that largely there's a real discrepancy between the lifespan of people. We measure our lives and the decisions we make in decades, in watching our kids grow up and watching our parents age. All that happens in just a couple decades, and that's a blink of an ecological or geologic eye, right? So as we're pivoting towards process, we understand that there's an inherent kind of disconnect between our political, our economic timeframes, and those that we're trying to manage in our natural resource disciplines. And I think that that's really important. I think it's really important for me to realize that there's no ideal, pristine former phase that we're trying to move towards, that we're on a trajectory. It's equally important to me to realize that we have no capacity to plan for perpetuity, right? In its real sense, but that we need to elongate our planning horizons so that we can really work at scale. And so in a lot of ways, what I think of is adapting setting out schedules that are 20, 50, maybe 100 years out, but then having the capacity to know that the world's changing. That's the one thing we can work on, and that we need to adapt as we move forward. So it's really about setting trajectories instead of this false notion that you can recreate anything, or that we can set some idea of what was again in the future. So for me, perpetuity isn't a very helpful term, and I think that we need to be more reasonable about the timelines that we're working
To me, I think what would be helpful, I don't have any idea how you do it in perpetuity, but we need to shift from, I'm a water district and I do water deliveries. Really, we manage 75 square miles of the Sacramento Valley, right? And I think we have the same sort of thing in our state and federal agencies. We have a Corps of Engineers that focuses on flood control in this footprint. We have U.S. Fish and Wildlife that focuses on, habitat in this footprint. And I don't think you can separate those agencies. You can't have the footprint managed for single purpose by different folks, because you need to be blending those practices and thinking about the footprint. So we need to kind of redesign, our responsibilities and how we approach those. And I think that'll start to shift us towards new opportunities and learning on how to best do it. But that's a big first step, because you have all this kind of finger pointing of, well, that's not quite mine, that's not quite mine, and really it's all ours. And we need to set up how we manage that together. So.
I guess I'll just sort of add that I think you have to look at it, again, in perpetuity. I don't know how we fund it, but you have to look at unintended consequences, right? And can we afford not to do this, right? Because if not doing it, do salmon go extinct, right? Do waterfowl populations just tank? And what does that look like? And can we afford to not do this and not continue to put money at it and get support and continue collaboration? Because I think the cost of not achieving this is greater than we really can anticipate.
Well, another term that maybe Jeff could add to here is shifting baselines, right? That's just the simple idea that what my dad thought of as normal is different than what his mother thought of as normal, right? That every human life, we change our expectation of what we should expect. And I think that in a lot of ways that is a race to the bottom, and that the science is actually showing a way that we can arrest those shifting baselines simply by drawing a line in the sand. We're not saying that this is the objective place that we should go, but if you can measure things, if you have a standard way of saying, this is how the world is right now, this is how many birds there are, this is why we think their birds are there, this is the physical criteria or the biophysical criteria by which we measure habitat, then we can actually draw that line. We can apply the scientific method, right? We can inform decision making to where these trends are going. And I think that is one of the most important things we can do. Is we tend to try to over innovate, and now what we're doing today we can't really compare to what we did in last decade and so on and so forth. So taking a really clear-eyed, fairly simple approach to understanding what the landscape looks like now, setting objectives, and then working towards them with measures that we stick with, so that we can actually chart and evaluate our progress towards it. That's a pretty important piece. And Jeff, it seems like that's something you probably encounter quite a bit.
Well, I think your reference to the shifting baselines is really interesting, and because it is this sense. You see these pictures of people fishing charters off Key West, and with each decade, the fish gets smaller and smaller. In the 20s and 30s, you see people with the fish are about the same height as the fishermen, and then in the most recent decade, they're catching a bunch of little fish, and the problem with the shifting baseline is that it's insidious, because you don't know what's really happening, and you redefine what is normal, and you lose track. But something that Jacob talked about, this restoration of abundance, and I feel like it's sort of it's this happy audacity to think that we could return abundance. And Lewis was referencing the numbers about returning salmon and trying to get, if we could get more salmon rearing in these good conditions, can we start building it back? And you hear the stories of the first people who were writing about their observations in our country, and they talked about rivers that were so full of fish that you could walk across them, you could walk across their backs. Well, I saw a picture from a tributary of the Penobscot River in Maine after removal of a few very small hydropower dams. They were about 1 or 2 megawatts, but they've been blocking hundreds of miles of spawning habitat for river herring and Atlantic salmon. And river herring have a very quick life cycle, so they return in abundance. And these pictures showed tributaries that were that were black with the backs of the herring filling the tributary almost to bursting. Now, if you tried to walk across them, you'd fall through. But I think that was the visual that the people had. They're like, look at that. It's wall-to-wall fish. And it's this audacity of thought that we could bring some of that abundance back, and we can shift some of these baselines back. And it's certainly going to be difficult. But again, the fact that you guys are talking about a system, and it's not just fancy talk about a system, but you're actually engaging at the system with the landowners and the managers and agriculture and water. And I think that's, there is a chance to have this audacity that you can shift some of these baselines back.
Jeff, you just ruined one of my great images. I always kind of assumed those fish at Key West was just Hemingway's storytelling, kind of larger than life as everything else he did. But that was actually really short, dude. Yeah. Oh, that's good. All right, we've got a question from Justin Frederickson. Thanks, Justin, for the question as always. And Justin wants to, I think, go up into the system a little bit and think about cold water and climate change and all the things surrounding that, and wants to think if there's some complementary actions that can be done above the dams that would complement the work that you all have been talking about here earlier. And have any thoughts on that opportunity?
Absolutely. I think that it gets back to this idea of yes, and that every single link in the chain is necessary if you're going to see that population level response. And that, as Lewis was saying right now, when it comes to winter run, trying to keep them on life support on the valley floor in, one of the hottest places anywhere, there's no way for us to be successful with that. We have to be able to return these fish populations to the cold water at higher elevations. We have a bathtub ring at 2,500 feet of rim dams, and that has to be part of the solution. And I have been so focused on this impact that I know that rearing habitat will have, that sometimes it can feel like that is in contrast to others, and that's not the case at all. So I think that there are so many different places where this could happen. The one that I'm most excited about is probably Battle Creek. So Battle Creek is habitat very similar to that in which the winter run evolved. It's the groundwater springs coming out of the Cascade Volcanics that is Lassen and Shasta. Most of that habitat is behind Shasta, but in Battle Creek lies the opportunity to reconcile, to reimagine what a watershed can do and how it's done. And that's both floodplains at its mouth, as well as reimagining and rebuilding, taking out some of the infrastructure at the top, but also repurposing some of the infrastructure. There's 13 different diversion and water infrastructure projects that are owned by PG&E, and PG&E is walking away from in Battle Creek. So there's a really, really important chance that where we could take Battle Creek and turn it into the model of a 21st century reconciled watershed that really does completely reimagine how we can change the patterns of interaction between water and landscape and fish.
Well, I think in a practical sense, you have to do that if you want to get the kind of freedom with Shasta to operate as a water supply project. You're going to have success at Battle Creek and probably a couple of other locations. But I do think that there are real possibilities for that to happen, and we need to work on that at the same time. There's landowners involved and PG&E and other folks, and so there's a deliberative process, but it's really important, and we need to accelerate that. We need to help the agencies accelerate that if we can. But that's part of the package. But I think what's exciting is essentially that package is what happened on View Creek, right? And we saw the fish come back with, rapidly. And so we work on those two pieces, and I think that's what's missing on the Sacramento. I think those two change the dynamic completely.
Luke, Mark, Jeff, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think we can move on to the next question.
Okay. Mark, Luke, okay. Well, I think we're pretty much, at the end of the road here. Just really want to thank Luke, Jacob, Mark, Lewis, and Jeff, thank you so much for joining.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And Bryce, just really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation today as part of the NACWA annual meeting. And let me send it back to you. And
well, this is fabulous. I don't think I have enough pages in my book to stay up. That was inspirational. There is not a drought of ideas here, is there? In fact, in my mind, it has such limited capacity, I needed to find a bypass of some sort to take it all in. There's a floodplain of great things going on. And I sure appreciate all you're doing and all your thoughts. And let's keep it up.
Unlevy the mind, Bryce.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you. We've all had, we'll have a challenging year ahead. Of course, when you talked about peaks and valleys, and we've got to work these valleys literally. But we will work together to manage our limited water supplies, and we appreciate all the efforts everyone is doing to bring our region, this region, to life. We look forward. We look forward to a future, a new way forward in the Sacramento Valley, and we look forward with excitement and with promise. We see with respect to a new and exciting conversation around our water resources. I'm sure the next generation will have a vibrant and exciting future in the Sacramento Valley. I know you guys don't want me to say this, but I had that tense conversation about the future with the guy who wasn't really in agreement with me. And he said, Bryce, when I talk about the future with you, just remember it begins with F-U-T. Exactly. Anyway, but in our group, we are working well together. And I love it that the fish and farm and water people are talking waterfowl, and the waterfowl and farmers are talking fish. And like you said, Jeff, isn't that what we're doing and working together to not to solve just our own issues, but the whole issue. And I am sure thankful for that. Thank you for joining today. Thank you, Ida and Daniela and Rob and Pat for your creativity. You brought the screen to life, Rob. Thank you so much. Thank you all for your strong and loyal dedication to working with NACWA. We look forward to seeing everyone this spring. And I would just ask, finally, pray for rain and pray for snow. I've often said, hope is not a strategy. We need to work together to develop plans and work like crazy to be and to make a difference. And I know that each of you are making a difference. We are all making a difference. However, I'm reminded by Jacob Katz, hope may not be a strategy, but it is essential. It is essential for health. Hope is essential for our communities, for our society, for our families, for our organizations that we dedicate our lives to, and for the future. So pray and hope, plan and work. We are making a difference. We, the members of NACWA and our community, are helping to make and keep our region successful and special. Happy birthday, NACWA. Happy 30 years. And let's go and continue to make a difference in our region. Thanks for joining today.
Well, the meeting is over. It's been great. What an amazing team we have here at NACWA. What an amazing group of speakers. Thank you for joining us today. And as we do with every NACWA meeting, we end it with beer. And isn't this the beer the proof that that there is a God and God loves us? That is good. There's got to be rice in there. Son of a gun. It tastes so good. Ken, You're sneaking some in there. I know you are. You know, beer is great, but water is life. Water is life. Water is life. Life is water. Beer is great. You know, water tastes pretty good too. I mean, okay. Yeah, well, beer tastes better, sure. Boy, it's a good day though. I sure hope I didn't offend Thad and Lewis. They are sure good friends, and I didn't mean to cast aspersion on their good name and all they're doing for us. You know, they are really wonderful people, and if I offended them, it was for a good cause, wasn't it? You know, I sure hope that I get to see you all at a real meeting next year. Son of a gun, we're going to be at the big room at Sierra Nevada, and we're going to be all toasting each other at Sierra Nevada Brewery next March 2023. Until then, raise your glass high, take a nice long drink, give hugs to all those people you love, and say a little prayer for some rain. And I guess say a little prayer for Carla Nemeth. And don't we all need that rain? Oh, son of a gun. Why doesn't it rain more here? I mean, dang, it's the wintertime. Holy, don't you just, I mean, people ask me, how you doing, Bryce? And I say, that's like pop-up and dome. And they say, what do you mean pop-up and dome? And I say, it's 2 tenths. Wow, it's just getting that way. I'm looking for a little rain. And you know, every day I get on my iPad and I get onto that weather app, and son of a gun, if it doesn't say, it's dry, it's clear, come on, rub it really nice, get on that weather app, rain, come on. Well, I don't know what's going on. You know, dancing's not working. Have a drink. You know, they say, you know, you get a little worried, and it's when it's not raining, it's kind of sobering. Sobering, doesn't that mean not drinking? When it doesn't rain, it's like leading me to drink. That's not sobering. Ha, have a beer. Well, it's been a wonderful day. Enjoy your rest of your Friday. Enjoy your weekend. Celebrate the North State. Celebrate NCWA. You know, October 20th, we're going to be celebrating the North State at Matchbook. What a great event. Man, we had so many people there, inside and out, masked and unmasked, but celebrating together. Please join us October 20th. Put it on your calendar now and join us at Matchbook Winery, October 20th, 2022.